Hello, my name is Sharron Wilkins Conrad, and I'm a Postdoctoral Fellow at Southern Methodist University Center for Presidential History. Thank you to Nicola Longford, Executive Director of the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, and Genevieve Kaplan for inviting me to speak tonight on A New Kennedy, John Kennedy and Civil Rights, 1960 to 1963. I should say that I spent many years on the museum staff before returning to school to complete my PhD, where I proceeded to spend an awful lot of time pestering my former colleagues for research help, and they never let me down, so I have to give a shout out to them as well. My interest in President Kennedy actually began when I was a child. Growing up in Pittsburgh, I could not remember a time when President Kennedy's portrait wasn't hanging next to one of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s in my godmother's home. President Kennedy's image, always positioned parallel to Dr. King's, taught me to respect their joint commitment to civil rights. That imagery, very common in Black households, stuck with me and became central to my doctoral research. It actually forms the centerpiece of a book I'm currently writing during my postdoctoral fellowship at SMU. And my work centers on how African Americans perceive the civil rights leadership of John Kennedy and his successor, Lyndon Johnson, and the way that these perceptions continue to shape how their presidencies are understood by Black people today. If we've learned nothing else from the past few weeks of nationwide outcry following the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, it should be that understanding how marginalized communities define meaningful allyship truly matters. The only way to gain that understanding is by listening to the voices within those communities. Today marks the 57th anniversary of a pivotal televised civil rights address that President Kennedy delivered to the American people from the Oval Office. And that speech solidified the exact moment when, for many Black citizens, John Kennedy became a genuine ally for civil rights. Contextualizing that moment helps us appreciate why his remarks reverberated so deeply in the Black community and why his image is evoked in African American popular culture still today. So I wanted to begin with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. A year after Kennedy's assassination, Dr. King reflected on John Kennedy's civil rights legacy in a commemorative issue of Look magazine. In the magazine, King marveled at President Kennedy's capacity to listen and to grow. And he concluded, quote, "There were, in fact, two John Kennedys. One presided in the first 2 years under pressure of the uncertainty caused by his razor-thin margin of victory. In 1963, a new Kennedy had emerged. He had found that public opinion was not in a rigid mold. He was, at his death, undergoing a transformation from a hesitant leader with unsure goals to a strong figure with deeply appealing objectives," close quote. Now, no group of people watched President Kennedy's transformation more closely than African Americans. And this evening, we'll revisit why African Americans were deeply skeptical of Kennedy's civil rights allyship in 1960, and why the appearance of the new Kennedy 3 years later made such a lasting impact on Black citizens. So I wanted to kind of communicate this to you by sharing with you the results of a poll that was conducted in 1966. When asked to name which of the 5 most recent presidents had done the most for civil rights, Black respondents to a Harris poll preferred Kennedy over Johnson by 54 percentage points. This, despite the fact that Johnson had signed both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So it was 1963's new Kennedy who was memorialized in Black households like my godmother's. And it was his image that is still evoked in African American popular culture more than 50 years later. So with that, let's go back to 1960. John Kennedy announced his candidacy on January 2nd, 1960, and the campaign emphasized him as a new leader who was needed for the times calling for greatness. If elected, Kennedy would be the first U.S. president born in the 20th century. He would be the youngest man ever elected to the office, and he would replace the oldest elected to that point. The African American community viewed his candidacy with misgivings. Other Democrats, such as Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota and Governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, through their words and actions, were deemed more reliable partners. Another candidate, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, was seen as hostile to the labor movement and Black interests because of his concessions to Southern segregationist Democrats. The Kennedy campaign was actually quite nervous. They worried that Eisenhower's gains in 1956 might indicate that Black voters could return to their historic loyalty to the Republican Party, which is viewed as the quote-unquote party of Lincoln since the Reconstruction era. That tie was first broken by FDR in the 1930s. Part of Eisenhower's appeal had to do with his decision to send federal troops into Little Rock in 1957 to uphold the Supreme Court's decision to desegregate Little Rock schools, and by the way that Ike had enforced integration of the armed services. But as you can see, in the presidential election in 1956, Eisenhower and Nixon had won 15% more of African American votes than they had in 1952. And so this caused a lot of consternation in the Democratic Party. Despite the 1956 election results, African Americans were decidedly disappointed by Eisenhower's emphasis on doing his duty when it came to civil rights, and by his refusal to acknowledge that doing so was actually the right thing to do. Democrats were also concerned because Vice President Richard Nixon had acted as Eisenhower's point person on a new Civil Rights Act of 1957, and he had befriended Martin Luther King, a figure that Kennedy barely knew. Nixon, by 1957, had been transforming himself into something of a civil rights advocate. Here we have a 1957 issue of Jet magazine, which is an African American cultural magazine that was called the Black Bible by many. Jet magazine in 1957 carried this article that basically laid out a conversation between Martin Luther King and his new friend, Richard Nixon. They had become kind of close, they had become friendly, they had kind of had a meeting of the minds around civil rights. And in this article, you see it's an exclusive to Jet, where Nixon tells King how he plans to help Negroes. For the Kennedy campaign, for Democrats, the fact that Richard Nixon had forged a relationship with Martin Luther King, who was becoming known as one of the most important civil rights leaders of the time, was truly worrisome. So what did they do? They decided to come up with an outreach team for the campaign to really reach out to the African American community. And I call this the ATeam. We have 4 individuals here. There were others, but I wanted to kind of highlight these 4. The first is Marjorie Lawson. She was an attorney, and she and her husband, Belford Lawson, were very well placed in the African American legal community, and they also had strong ties to the African American sorority and fraternity community. And Marjorie was one of the very first people that came on to Kennedy's campaign to help him connect with the African American community. Then you have Frank Reeves, seen here. He was highly placed in the NAACP, and he too was a lawyer who had roles in the Democratic National Committee. So he was well placed as well. And his role would be to travel with the candidate, Senator Kennedy, to help brief him on different stops, introduce him to the right people, and steer him in the right directions. Val Phillips was a Milwaukee councilwoman. She was, in fact, the first African-American councilwoman in Milwaukee. She, too, was involved in the Democratic Party. She became a delegate to the Democratic National Convention, and she was someone that Kennedy kind of relied on almost in a friendly manner, but she too was an important political ally. And then the last person was Lewis Martin. He became known as by his nickname, the Black Godfather of politics, the godfather of Black politics. Lewis Martin was known for starting an organization, an association of Negro publishers, and that was a federation of Black newspaper and magazine publishers, and he was someone who was very well placed for getting the word out to the Black community. Very extraordinary person and important person to bring onto the team. So these are the four people, and if you had asked them in 1960 what was the #1 issue that they had in promoting John F. Kennedy's candidacy to the Black community, they probably all would have answered the same way: getting the Black community to overlook Kennedy's vote on the 1957 Civil Rights Bill. And so we'll get to that. But I want you to pay a little bit of attention, particularly to Marjorie Lawson and to Vel Phillips, because they're going to come back into this story of Kennedy's response to the Civil Rights Bill. Here's another individual I want you to know. This is Ruth Batson. She was a local community leader and very involved in education politics of Boston, her hometown. She had volunteered for Kennedy's senatorial campaign when he first ran for the US Senate. And by the time he was thinking about running for president in 1957, she had become very actively involved in the NAACP, the regional New England NAACP. And she was a lobbyist for NAACP efforts. And here is an excerpt from her oral history. And I want to kind of bring your attention to this little segment that I've highlighted. And it'll kind of give us an introduction to the problem that many people had with Kennedy's vote in 1957. She says, "We became involved with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It was my duty to lobby our New England congressional representatives. It was then that I became very disappointed in the way that Senator Kennedy voted on this bill. He had said he wasn't going to vote for the crippling amendments being attached to the bill. I had sent him a telegram and written to him, and he said he would not vote for them. And I was very disappointed when he reversed himself." So let me take a step back. The 1957 Civil Rights Act was the first piece of legislation on civil rights since Reconstruction. It was very important, particularly focused on voting rights. In the South in particular, African Americans were kept from voting for all sorts of ridiculous reasons. But one of the reasons was that anytime there was a legal confrontation where African Americans would be brought in before court of law, their cases would be decided by a jury of their peers. And by a jury of their peers, that was meant as an all-white jury in the South. And so oftentimes African Americans could not get a fair trial, and this would cause all kinds of impediments for them trying to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 would have changed that by making it that these cases would have been decided by a federal judge. Instead of a jury of their peers, a federal judge could come in and oversee certain legal situations. And so this was seen as great progress. Well, when Ruth Batson was asking Senator Kennedy to not vote for any of the crippling amendments that the Southern segregationists were putting forward, Democrats by and large, she had secured his promise that he would not vote for any of them. But the beautiful thing about this oral history that I absolutely love is that when she went in to give her oral history, Miss Batson brought the receipts. She actually brought the telegram that she had received from Senator Kennedy in which he promised that he was not going to vote for those crippling amendments. And here is the reference down here. She says, "This was July 10th, 1957, and yes, it says, 'Received your telegram. You may be assured I will support Civil Rights Bill without crippling amendments.'" And he did just the opposite. She felt so betrayed by him, as did many African Americans. Marjorie Lawson, when she came on board support the campaign, she said that over and over again, this was the number one thing that Black citizens would mention to her when she was trying to recruit them to support Senator Kennedy's presidency. And Vel Phillips, the Milwaukee councilwoman, she said that the very first time that she met Kennedy in 1957, she had been a big fan of the Massachusetts senator, but with his vote on the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and his support of these crippling amendments really changed her mind. And I want to read you a quick quote from Miss Phillips. She said that when she met with him, and he was in Milwaukee, she said that she told him forthright that she had been a fan, and she said, quote, "I have to be honest with you. I just don't feel the same." And she said it took every single last ounce of John Kennedy's charm, which he worked on her to bring her around, and he eventually did. And she admitted that by the end of the evening, after talking to him and getting certain promises from him that he had made a mistake, that she was fully back on with her crush of the senator. And so it took a lot for him to be able to win her back over. And so it just gives you a sense for the magnitude of that mistake. It sounded a bunch of alarm bells for African Americans who weren't quite certain about him. So that by the Democratic National Convention that July in Los Angeles of 1960, African Americans were incredibly suspicious of John Kennedy. They didn't think that he was the best candidate. Many preferred the Hubert Humphrey, the senator from Minnesota, or Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, people who had shown and proven that they were advocates of African Americans. John Kennedy, they were very wary of. At that convention, you had a number of people express their concern. One of them was NAACP Director Roy Wilkins, who said, quote, that Kennedy was, quote, rubbing elbows with Southern Democrats to boost his chances of winning the nomination. And Harry Belafonte, the musician and activist, put it this way. He said he had met with Senator Kennedy even before the primary season, and he walked away feeling, well, unimpressed. He said, quote, "Pleasant enough fellow, but nothing about him suggested I would have such inclination to switch allegiances. I would stick with Adlai Stevenson." So these concerns were there, but they were willing to kind of overlook them if Kennedy was the candidate, and he was voted in on the very first ballot. And so African Americans were concerned, but willing to give him a chance, and then he did this. John Kennedy selected Texan Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson as his vice presidential candidate, and for many Black delegates at that convention, they wanted to bolt the convention. They felt that they had been deeply betrayed. Once again, it triggered all these memories of Kennedy's vote on the Civil Rights Bill. And so there were worries because they knew that Lyndon Johnson had made a lot of concessions to Southern Democrats who were segregationists over the years in order to get various pieces of legislation passed, and there was a lot of concern. Ruth Batson and Marjorie Lawson and the entire outreach team decided they needed to do something. And so what they did was they arranged a luncheon for the Black delegation to meet with Kennedy and Johnson. And the newly formed ticket went into the Lion's Den with this very hot and angry group of Black delegates to try to convince them that it was going to be all right. And Miss Batson in particular, and Marjorie Lawson as well, both indicated in their oral histories that Kennedy came into the luncheon, he made a very fine speech about unity, and it was somewhat reassuring, but in fact, it was Lyndon Johnson who won the day and who swayed the room. And he did so by walking in, and he didn't actually preach, but he kind of did in a sense. And this is what he said. He said, "There's an old Baptist prayer, a hymn. Where he leads me, I will follow." And then he repeated that line and said, "Where he leads me," pointing to John Kennedy, I will follow. And then he made a promise to the room. He said, we will make more progress in the field of civil rights in 4 years than has been made in 100 years. Well, that won the room. And for the most part, people were willing to give the ticket a chance. And they began to do various things on a campaign trail that were largely symbolic, but they did have meaning for those who were following along. First of all, they made the decision that they would have a desegregated press corps come along with the campaign. So the press corps was fully integrated, and no matter where the campaign traveled, even if it was into the Deep South, if they were only provided with segregated facilities, they would, if necessary, fly out of the South that night so that they could show the African Americans that were a part of the campaign the respect that was due them. They would not use segregated facilities throughout the campaign. So this was symbolic, and little by little, Lewis Martin was arranging lots of outreach, specifically with Senator Kennedy. And one of the places he took Senator and Mrs. Kennedy was to Howard University, which is where I did some of my schooling, so yay Howard. He took them there to a packed auditorium. And this is what he said about Kennedy, that over the course of the campaign, quote, Kennedy knew how to handle himself. And he had become familiar enough with all the forces that work within the Black community, and he had a very high moral sensibility about injustice. And so slowly but surely, John Kennedy is getting much more familiar, much more comfortable in talking to and about issues of concern to the Black community. Well, 1960, I have to just say this because it just amazes me, but in 1960, candidate Kennedy can announce for the presidency in January of the year, win a few primaries over the winter and spring, then have his convention in July, and by September, October, be in the middle of presidential debates with his opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, and then a few weeks later, the entire thing was over. So between January of 1960 and the second week of November of that year, that contained the entirety of that campaign. That is not something that we are accustomed to today, but it was certainly how things were then. But what that meant is that things that happened in the late stages of the campaign could have a great impact. And so here's an image of the presidential debate in 1960. Kennedy and Nixon were participants in the very first televised debates. And in the first debate, well, one of the things I should say is that a lot of people, when they think of the debates, they hear the story about how John Kennedy was said to be the winner from those individuals who watched the debate on television, but Richard Nixon was said to have won by those who listened to the debate on the radio. But for African Americans, it was Kennedy by a mile. And the reason was because in the very first debate, which was the one that was paid the most attention to, in his 8-minute opening remarks, John Kennedy actually referenced the disparities between African Americans and white Americans. And he said, I think we can do better. And African Americans heard that message, and it meant something to him. And I want to read just a quick quote from Simeon Booker. He was an outspoken journalist who worked for Johnson Publishing, Jet Magazine. And this is how he read that moment. He said, it became a turning point in the Negroes because Nixon didn't discuss civil rights. Kennedy did. He did step out. It made an impression, and I could begin to see a certain feeling shift. So these are the last several weeks of the campaign, and Simeon Booker is feeling a shift in momentum among the African Americans that he's interacting with, and that debate performance was one of them. The other key significant thing that happened was in the week just prior to Election Day. And this event was happening down in Georgia. Martin Luther King had been arrested on really trumped up charges related to a traffic violation. he was arrested, and rather than just kept in the local jail in and around Atlanta, he was sent to a maximum security prison miles and miles away and sentenced to hard labor. Well, with all that we're going through at this particular moment about police and police violence, Dr. King's wife, Coretta Scott King, was understandably freaking out about this. She's 6 months pregnant. Her husband has been taken to a maximum security prison and sentenced to hard labor. She was very realistically concerned that he may never make it home. And so she starts making calls to people like Harris Wofford, who she knew from his work in the civil rights movement, who was now working in the Kennedy campaign. She was calling Frank Reeves, who had just been in Atlanta not too long before that, and trying to find help wherever she could get it. She was calling Richard Nixon because of their great friendship with the Nixons, and she wanted help. Well, Frank Reeves, Lewis Martin, Harris Wofford, Sergeant Shriver, the senator's brother-in-law, got together and concocted a plan by which the senator would give Mrs. King a call. And they convinced Senator Kennedy to give her a call, which he did, and he spoke for her for all of 90 seconds. And he reassured her, he expressed his solidarity with her and his concern for her, and said that if there's anything I can do, please just let me know. Hung up the phone. It seems like it's over, but it is not over, because when the campaign manager, Robert Kennedy, finds out about this news, he is livid, and he might have used language. He's livid because he realizes how razor thin this election is going to be, and that the call to Mrs. King might sway white Southern voters. Well, the good news for the campaign is that most white Southern press agents weren't covering this. They didn't really care about it. And so the word didn't get out that Kennedy had called Mrs. King. Furthermore, so for the most part, it didn't make a difference. But the team, the ATeam of outreach that had been recruited, decided that they could make the most of this. They created this brochure that's on the screen right now, The Case of Martin Luther King, and they referred to this brochure as the Blue Bomb because they knew that it could make a big impact. And it basically just has a number of quotes from those who were involved in this entire episode. Dr. King was released within days of the call to Mrs. King, and so he was safe. But they had this opportunity. The campaign under Robert Kennedy never would have approved releasing this Blue Bomb brochure, but they surreptitiously printed 3 million copies and distributed them, not in the South, because for the most part, this Black Southern vote was relatively small because of all of the kind of shenanigans keeping Black voters from the polls in the South. But they distributed the 3 million brochures outside of churches the Sunday before the election and in the Black newspapers throughout the North. And in the brochure itself, you have a quote from Mrs. King just expressing how good it felt to hear from Senator Kennedy personally about his concern. You have a quote from Dr. King talking about his gratitude to the senator for making the call and making his wife feel a little bit of relief. But importantly, you have this quote right here in the middle. And this is a quote from Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., so Daddy King's quote. And Daddy King is a force to be reckoned with in the Black church to begin with. And he has some things to say about all of this. And let's read what he had to say. He says, I had expected to vote against Senator Kennedy because of his religion, but now he can be my president, Catholic or whatever he is. It took courage to call my daughter-in-law at a time like this, and he has the moral courage to stand up for what he knows is right. So he's going to vote for Kennedy now, despite the fact that he's Catholic. He doesn't see a problem with admitting that that was his rationale for not voting. The other key thing is that it emphasized that Nixon never commented on this whole thing. So he had developed this friendship with Dr. King, and he never responded to Coretta Scott King's call. Well, the Chicago Defender, which is one of the most important Black newspapers of the country at the time, hailed Senator Kennedy's role in the cleric's release. He's free on bond. You have on the front page of the Defender, the week of the election, this amazing reunion scene between the Dr. King and his family, and this story right in the center of the front page about Daddy King's swing to the Democratic fold. It sent a powerful message. In days after Kennedy was actually elected, the Chicago Defender did not fail to alert its readership that the Negro vote had ensured Kennedy's victory. This is very important because now African Americans feel like Kennedy owes them something. He owes them his support. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is this story about Kennedy tapping Andrew Hatcher. Hatcher becomes the very first Black staff member ever in the White House press corps. So here's a picture of Andrew Hatcher standing over President Kennedy and Pierre Salinger, who's in charge of the White House press office at the time. So what Kennedy has decided to do in his early weeks in office is he's going to really play this symbolic thing to the hilt. So he's hiring, these are relatively easy decisions for him to make, but he has made it clear that he is not doing any of the hard things. He has announced that he will not push for a civil rights bill. He announces that he is not going to sign an executive order that would desegregate federal housing, which was something that he had during the campaign promised that a president could do with the stroke of a pen. He said, no, I'm not going to do that either. He was instead going to rely on enforcing the laws that were already on the books. And one other thing that he did, actually it started on Inauguration Day, is he noticed that the U.S. Coast Guard Honor Guard was a segregated unit, and he requested that that be desegregated going forward. And he also alerted the Black press that that was something that he was doing. So because it was not something that he put out a press release over, but it was something that the very savvy Kennedy administration made sure that the Black community was familiar with. But just because Kennedy had his timeline doesn't mean that protesters and activists were on his timeline. In 1961, you had members of the Congress on Racial Equality starting up with the Freedom Rides to test the interstate commerce and interstate transportation as being desegregated, and they were on Greyhound buses and testing out that system. You also had, by the October of 1962, James Meredith integrating Old Miss University. Meredith was a Mississippi, son of Mississippi, a Air Force veteran who applied for the University of Mississippi and was admitted until they found out that he was a Black student, and then they tried to reject him. His case made its way through the courts, and by the end of September, they had to enforce his acceptance into the University of Mississippi. So here you see Meredith flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. He was trying to register that day and was turned away. Later that night, Meredith is ensconced somewhere else. The town of Oxford, Mississippi erupts into riots, and 2 people are killed in the melee that follows. And many people, when they hear of the James Meredith story, they talk about, and even historians do this too, they talk about how James Meredith was so inspired by John Kennedy's inaugural address and the hopefulness evoked in that address that he decided that he would apply to the University of Mississippi. But that's not what Meredith himself says. In his own words, from a memoir that he's published, he says, quote, "I was not inspired by John F. Kennedy as a potential civil rights savior. I knew that so far in his career, JFK had done virtually nothing to help the cause of Black Americans. John and Robert Kennedy were, until 1961, lifelong collaborators with white supremacy. But when forced to confront it, they eventually recognized that Black Americans as full citizens because Black people were fighting." So whereas many people look to the James Meredith story, and there's this kind of existing kind of storyline about his being inspired by Kennedy. He really wanted to challenge Kennedy to live up to what he was up to, what he said that he was about. And this is what prompted Meredith's application to the University of Mississippi. And it also shows that there's still, even by 62, this lingering suspicion about John Kennedy and whether or not he was a true ally to the cause. Well, by 1963, January of 1963, there was really little reason to think that this was going to be this year in which a new Kennedy was going to emerge. In fact, there was reason to think that 1963 was going to look a lot like 1961 and 1962. In fact, here's a copy of a proposal that Dr. Martin Luther King created. He wanted Kennedy to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation, kind of to coincide with the centennial of Lincoln signing and the enactment of the Emancipation Proclamation. He had an entire plan for what this could be. He suggested that they could have a ceremony at the Lincoln Memorial that happened on January 1st to kind of commemorate when the Emancipation actually went into effect. And John Kennedy wanted nothing to do with this. So he kind of stalled King, and he suggested that King put something in writing. And so this is the appeal that Dr. King crafted with his team for the second Emancipation Proclamation, which was promptly ignored by John Kennedy. Instead, what the Kennedy administration did was they hosted a gala, a fete for the Black community, and sent out 1,000 invitations and had some of the who's who of the African-American society at the White House for a reception. So you can see in this portrait, obviously, this photograph, you have Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy, Vice President and Mrs. Johnson. You have Roy Wilkins of the NAACP. You have James Foreman of the Congress on Racial Equality. Over here, you have Whitney Young of the Urban League, also in attendance, Langston Hughes, Sammy Davis Jr. I mean, it's a who's who of Black America. But the one person who did not show up was Martin Luther King Jr. And he didn't go because he said, in his words, that this was a token victory. He was worried about dangerous gradualism and how this kind of effort was taking away from more important efforts. But Lewis Martin, the Kennedy staffer and newspaper man, saw it very differently. In his words, quote, "There are times when symbolism becomes substance. And I think this event made a difference in Black thinking about whether they were acceptable or not." And so for him, this meant far more than just, a party. In fact, for him, he was probably thinking back to Frederick Douglass being turned away at the White House, to the brouhaha surrounding Booker T. Washington's invitation to Teddy Roosevelt's White House, Monroe Trotter at the White House, that there were these episodes in which African Americans had been turned away, and here they were welcomed with open arms. So for Lewis Martin, this was a significant turn of events. And Roy Wilkins of the NAACP also made a very, I think, telling and important point about this. He said that, quote, "Kennedy made it no longer fashionable to be prejudiced, to exercise discrimination, even though you have it and even though you practice it. There used to be a time when it was talked about, bragged about. It was a thing." So for Wilkins, this type of event was indicative of the shift that Kennedy brought to Washington, D.C. and to the nation. It was no longer fashionable to be a blatant racist during Kennedy's administration. In fact, if you were a racist, you needed to hide it in some sense. And so for Wilkins, this was a transformational kind of aspect of Kennedy's leadership. Well, while all of this is happening, by June 11th of 1963, yet another pair of students, this time James Hood and Vivian Malone, are trying to enter the University of Alabama as its first Black students. And here you have a photograph showing Alabama Governor George Wallace and his infamous stand at the schoolhouse door, where he makes a big production to show that he is against integration and that he was a strong supporter of segregation. And he's standing here next to Nicholas Katzenbach, who is Deputy Attorney General under Robert Kennedy. And here is a photo showing Vivian Malone as she is entering into one of the buildings at the University of Alabama. So all of this is, this whole play, this tragedy in some sense, was playing out on national television. But what viewers at home didn't realize is back in Washington, D.C., there's a big debate in the Kennedy administration as to whether or not he should make an announcement about civil rights legislation. They had kind of crafted a letter. He'd been kind of thinking about doing it. And even throughout the course of the day, he had gone back and forth. But eventually he decided that he wanted to make a speech. And so Robert Kennedy and the rest of the White House staff start scrambling to put something together. And if you ever make it to the Kennedy Library, you can see the original printout of the speech, as well as the kind of last minute changes that President Kennedy was making before he delivered it. And in fact, he presented some of it extemporaneously. So why don't we take a quick look at a short portion of the speech. This is President Kennedy's address to the nation on civil rights, delivered that same day from the Oval Office.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
Well, this made a profound impact on African-American viewers and all viewers, but particularly Black viewers as they watched this speech. It turned into an onslaught of telegrams and letters to the White House from people of all races, but African Americans in particular were writing to the president with their messages and their response. And this one comes a telegram from Shirley Ann McNeil from Detroit. She says, "Sometimes in all of our lives, something so wonderful happens, it makes up for the unfairness of a lifetime. It may be a word spoken in a moment, but it's enough. As a Negro, I did not expect in my lifetime to have a president publicly proclaim equality for all." In this letter that was dated the same day from Mr. and Mrs. Linton Freeman of Cleveland, Ohio, kind of expresses some of the same sentiments. "We have just listened with great interest to your eloquent speech to the American people. We had expected it long before now, but you seem to have made it at the time when it was most needed." And they express how encouraged they felt by this. Well, Kennedy had gone so far, he had made this pitch, he had spoken directly to white Americans as well as Black Americans about the moral rationale for the civil rights movement, something that Black citizens had been asking for and demanding and hoping for. But you can see from the telegram and letter that most didn't expect to ever hear it. He was willing to go that far and to be a vocal ally for Black citizens, but he was not willing to go down to the March on Washington in August of that year. He was very concerned that this event was going to turn into this violent ruckus that would undermine the civil rights legislation that he wanted, but he did invite the organizers back to the White House after. And so this is a photograph of them at the White House after. And not everybody was thrilled with the March on Washington. Malcolm X of the Nation of Islam in particular called the March on Washington the farce on Washington, because what had originally been envisioned was a radical revolutionary demand for economic justice. And in the end, it seemed like it became more of a celebration of integration. And so he could not support that. Well, the costs to Kennedy were very real. The costs politically were real enough that he decided to come to Texas in November of that year to try to heal the rift between those two facets of the Democratic Party in Texas that were breaking because of civil rights and other issues. And he organized a 5-city tour through Texas, and here he is on the day that he's in Fort Worth on his way to Dallas. You can see that it's a rainy day, and I adore this photo from the Sixth Floor Museum of this gentleman in his trench coat, and he's got this fantastic fedora on, and he is reaching out to President Kennedy, who has now become this embodiment of the hope of that new Kennedy that we now think of when we think of Kennedy and civil rights. But later that day, here outside of Parkland Hospital, you have the kind of flip side of the coin, 2 unidentified African-American women who are just inconsolable at the news that President Kennedy has been killed. That week, and in a couple weeks after the assassination, the University of Chicago did a study asking for public reaction to the behavior and about their behavior following the assassination. And an interesting statistic came out of that. Black respondents were 2.5 times more likely to find a white supremacist motive for Kennedy's murder than their white counterparts. For Black Americans, when they thought about the risks that Kennedy was willing to take, it was more than about political risk. For Black observers, Kennedy had risked his life by speaking out, and many Black citizens believed that he was killed for his advocacy on their behalf. Johnson Publishing put out an album of Kennedy's civil rights speeches, and again, you have this kind of this action, this desperation to reach out to President Kennedy. And here's my man right here. I love this little guy sitting there waiting and hoping that he's noticed by President Kennedy. And in the Black press, you have these efforts to advertise ways to commemorate your President Kennedy. So you can buy a bracelet or a necklace or a pen. But over here is what I want to draw your attention to. This is where they're selling portraits of the late president and asking the question, have you a picture of our martyred president in your home? So this is just one of the ways that African Americans began this process of commemorating John Kennedy in their home, and not just a portrait of a late president, but of a martyred president, a president killed for civil rights. And the letters came into Jackie Kennedy also sending that same message. Here's a letter from Orville Brooks in Chicago, where he says to Mrs. Kennedy, "Your husband, I believe, died for the sake of Negro people. Although he was assassinated, his name will live forever throughout the world and the united population of Negroes." In this letter from a 15-year-old Chicago girl, Janice Brooks, where I believe that Janice Brooks was the sassiest, but the very first youngest conspiracy theorist ever, because she writes Mrs. Kennedy and she says, quote, "As much as I don't like Johnson, they need to throw him off the stand. I believe Johnson had something to do with it because Johnson wanted to be president so bad. He played like he was so sad, but on television seemed like he were glad." So, yes, and she had a few other choice pieces of advice for Mrs. Kennedy in that letter. You begin to see in funeral homes printing church fans with both Kennedys and King, and under the banner of freedom fighters. So this is continuing even well into the late 60s and the early 70s. And in 1964, in downtown Dallas, Clarence Broadnax, a young man who is just coming back from a military recruiter's office, decides to stop into the Piccadilly cafeteria downtown, where he is told that they cannot serve him because it remains segregated. And he starts a protest rally that lasts an entire month, but he makes this sign asking, did JFK die in vain? And he carries it as he confronts this manager of the Piccadilly. He is inspired, his activism is inspired by Kennedy's message and Kennedy's image, which he uses. Last 2 points. This continues today. In recent films, as recent as 2016, the film Fences, directed by Denzel Washington, in the final scene, Corey Maxson comes home. He's a Marine. He's there to deal with his father's death and to kind of deal with the fact that he and his father had been estranged. As he goes into the backyard in the final scenes of the film to kind of be in the space where they had their last big fight, here you see Kennedy's picture on the wall alongside of Dr. King's. Again, a reminder, you have a path, you have a way to go, you have people to look to, and these are the people that his family wants him to look to for guidance. In the 2016 film Hidden Figures, again, Katherine Johnson, African-American mathematician and computer at NASA. Here she is here, played by Taraji Henson. All the white male co-workers who don't respect her her as a mathematician, don't respect her as a Black woman, don't respect her at all. They're all focused on the boss, played by Kevin Costner, but Katherine Johnson, her sightline is on this portrait of President Kennedy on the wall. And again, later in the film, here we have Katherine at her desk. They're all watching this space flight on television, and she is sitting just below this portrait of Kennedy. He's always there. He's always watching over her. Now, for white audiences, you might not understand that or recognize it or see it, but for Black audiences who've been raised in this tradition, this speaks to you, and it sends a message about, a reminder about President Kennedy and the type of leadership we should seek and look to. Well, with that, I'm going to just wrap it up by saying that prior to 1963, John Kennedy was a supporter of civil rights, but he wasn't a full ally for civil rights. He was an ally for civil rights in 1963 when he was willing to risk something. He put himself at risk politically, and for Black Americans, they believe he gave the ultimate sacrifice by putting his life on the line for civil rights. At this time, I want to make sure that there's a few minutes left for questions. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you again to the Sixth Floor Museum for letting me speak about this topic, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad. We do have a couple of questions, and just a reminder, if anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A box, and we will relay that question. The first question is from Julie, and she's commenting, very illuminating presentation. Thanks, Dr. Conrad. I'm admittedly naive to this history, but I think it was clear that the role of female advisors and allies was important to Kennedy's plan, future, and campaign. What are your thoughts on Biden's commitment to identifying a female vice president running mate? What about an African-American running mate, male or female?
I think that Joe Biden would be very wise to consider an African-American woman as his running mate. I think that, I think that Joe Biden has a certain affection in the Black community. However, I think that by demonstrating that, by kind of, especially at this moment when we have been dealing with so much on these issues of race, I think that it would send a powerful message. And if he chose the right candidate, I can't tell him which one because there are lots of reasons why he might choose someone over the other, but I think that if they're doing their calculations, that they really can't go wrong by choosing the right Black woman to be his running mate.
Very good. And the next question comes from Archibald Bryant. Why did the original members of the Black community who supported Kennedy for president and eventually got considerable other members of the Black community to support Kennedy's candidacy for president did so?
So could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. Why did the original members of the Black community who supported Kennedy for president and eventually got considerable other members of the Black community to support Kennedy's candidacy for president do so?
Well, thank you for that question. I think that, for many people, African Americans were like all American citizens. Very kind of, Kennedy's appeal was, an appeal that cut across racial lines. I think that he was an inspiring candidate. He was a war hero. In some of the depictions that African Americans had of Kennedy in their homes, many of them would also have pictures of him on his PT-109 boat, so that his war record was also something that was deemed, something that they could admire. One thing that, it's kind of a small thing, but perhaps it made a difference, is that when the senator won the Pulitzer Prize for Profiles in Courage, he donated his prize money to the United Negro College Fund. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was kind of a symbolic gesture that he made. And so I think that people appreciated him for what he was. He did seem to be an inspirational figure with an inspirational message. And so I think that that had appeal no matter what race you are.
The next question comes from James. He's asking, how do you account for the poll giving Kennedy 69% of the vote compared to LBJ's 15% is doing the most for African Americans?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I just think that, so that's like one of the final chapters of my book. The final chapters of my book are going to deal with LBJ and the Black community. I think that even while Kennedy was winning over Black support during the campaign and into his administration, because Vice President Johnson was more in the shadows as vice president, he played a certain role. He was doing some good work in the administration on civil rights, but it was more in the background. He was not as kind of visible as Kennedy, and so he didn't get the kind of credit that Kennedy got for the efforts that were taken during his the Kennedy administration. And so the kind of concerns that many Black voters had about Johnson never really went away. Even when Johnson became president and said that we are going to, pass the civil rights bill that President Kennedy fought for so hard and wanted so badly, many African Americans said he's only doing it to get the vote. He's only doing it because Kennedy was doing it. And so Johnson rarely got credit for taking steps to, of his own accord. And so unfortunately, that kind of hesitance, that mistrust of Johnson, it lingered for some time. And so I think that, and obviously because Kennedy had become something even greater than kind of a president, but after his death, he became a martyred figure. And that's kind of a tough one to compete against.
All right. The next question is from Ryan asking, would Kennedy's transformation gone far enough to achieve what LBJ did with the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act if he had lived?
Yes, even some of the African Americans in their oral histories, the one who lauded Kennedy and his efforts and his work, many of them talked about the fact that they didn't think that Kennedy would have been able to get done what Johnson got done. They just didn't think that Kennedy's skill set would have allowed him to get it done. Plus, of course, when Johnson goes before Congress and speaks to a joint session of Congress for the first time, he basically tells them that the best way to honor Kennedy's memory would be by passing the civil rights bill that he wanted. And so he was able to use that leverage over maybe Democrats, Republicans, anyone who perhaps was hesitating. And so Kennedy obviously wouldn't have had that particular piece of leverage over Congress. And so many people, including African Americans, think that as wonderful as they may have thought Kennedy was, they think that Johnson was the only one who could have gotten this legislation passed and all of the kind of subsequent legislation.
All right, we've got 3 more questions. The first one is from Zuri asking, you mentioned you're currently working on a book. Will you make any parallels to today's climate with almost identical civil rights problems?
Yes, thank you, Zuri, from Savannah. Yeah, I definitely, the things that are happening right now are influencing how I'm thinking about, Kennedy's leadership, Johnson's leadership. Obviously, there were uprisings following Dr. King's death during Johnson's presidency that really had implications for, quite frankly, how white moderates viewed the movement. A lot of people pulled back after the uprisings following King's death and the violence that, angry, frustrated people, inflicted on their cities. And so, yeah, I think that it will influence how I think about things. I do think that today's kind of moment is very different. It's bad. I mean, both times were bad, but there's some hope in how this seems to be a conversation about fixing these injustices and bringing on board white allies, and what allyship really looks like. It's more than just kind of saying you are interested in African-American lives and support. It means putting yourself at risk to some extent, putting some real skin in the game in order to demonstrate that you are a true ally. It wasn't enough to do the symbolic things. The symbolic things are easy. True allyship means doing things that are hard. And so that is certainly going to influence how I kind of approach the final chapters of my book.
All right, Jeff asks, other presidents, including Ulysses S. Grant, have attempted to promote equality through acts of Congress. A defining moment was the KKK uprising against him and thwarting his efforts. No president has been able to achieve the equality that we're asking for. Do you think the KKK will have enough power to keep this effort from being successful?
Goodness, well, I certainly hope not. I mean, I think that the moment is different. I think that, when you watch the news, as I've been trying to avoid to a certain extent, but when you watch the news and you see these communities pulling down Confederate statues and monuments and memorials, and in many cases, the people who are pulling these things down are members of the white community. It makes me think that, it's not going to be as easy to split the African-American concerns from the white concerns, and just to be able to have like a KKK movement come in and try to make this about being against Black Americans. I think that there is something different in this moment, and I hope that that difference leads to a different outcome.
All right. And our last 2 questions. Had President Kennedy lived and been reelected in 1964, how would it have changed America for its Black citizens?
That is very difficult because, had President Kennedy lived, I wonder if all of the programs that Johnson was able to get through as part of Great Society would have ever seen the light of day. I think that Kennedy's death and shifted thinking, certainly in Congress, and shifted, obviously, the leadership in the White House in ways that were transformative. I'm not certain that President Kennedy, because of the kind of tight margin of victory in 1960, I'm not sure that he would have had the mandate that Lyndon Johnson had after 1964 with his kind of landslide victory. And so, that's a tough question. It's kind of one of those conundrums. It's unclear what life would have looked like had President Kennedy lived. We can only respond to the world that he left behind.
And our last questions from Raul, and I think it's a great question to end on. What can we take from the era of JFK and apply it to our present day, seeing as though racial tensions are higher than ever?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I thank Raul for that question. I personally think that we have to expect more from our leaders. I don't think that tokenism or just, kind of false support is really enough. And this is one of the reasons why, some people looking at the upcoming presidential election get kind of freaked out when some of the progressives are pretty hard on Joe Biden's candidacy, and they really criticize him for, being kind of less progressive, I guess, than they are on certain issues. But we have to hold him accountable. If he is the Democratic nominee, he has to be held accountable. We, I think, should take away from this that, we deserve a true ally in the White House. We shouldn't take second measures. We should try to hold them accountable as they are, running their campaigns and coming up with the platform for the convention, and hold them to those things. So we shouldn't accept less than our best. And that's both with the president that's in the White House right now, and it's with the president who is elected after November. We should anticipate and expect a leader who is going to be a true ally and working to fix the problems that are part of this country's history and part of our present.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Conrad, for a fascinating lecture. I'm seeing several comments that we'll share later about how much everyone has learned tonight, and done a fabulous job. The problem with doing virtual programs, you don't get a round of applause, but just imagine a giant standing ovation for yourself.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And you've been such a pleasure to work with. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you so much. And want to say thank you to all of you for staying tonight. We very much hope that you will join us again in the future for more virtual presentations that we'll be putting together. And if you care to support the Sixth Floor Museum, feel free to go to the museum website at jfk.org and see how you can support the museum through a variety of ways. Thank you again to Dr. Conrad and all of you, and we hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much.